Hey, what's up everyone? Dave Dustin here again, another comics history video for you. This one is going to be all about the Australian comics campaign. So I just made that last video about the British comics campaign. This is going to be all about what happened in Australia, their anti-comics propaganda booklets that came out, and I'm going to go over a bunch of censorship that happened in the 50s and even into the 60s, and look at a bunch of EC comics and the comparisons between the Australian versions and the original Americans. Because this is all about Australian comics, on my rack I've changed up again. These are all comics published in Australia. So I had a lot of them brought from Australia itself, and some of them were from the UK I had brought over. These are all Australian comics with some really rare, really awesome stuff up there for you to look at too. So anyway, look at this first. This is Sin and Syndication, a cultural crime wave that menaces Australia. So this is compiled by the Australian Journalists Association and printed by the Worker Trustees in 1949. There's no date on the booklet, but I dated it as 1949 from some of the stuff inside. So as you can see, your child is under this cloud, terror comics, morgue murders, crime, Marvel, sex, crime, horror. So a lot of sensational stuff right from as soon as you open it. What is syndication? It goes on. Even the US can't take it. How it affects your family. There's another great image down there. True Yank horror stories. Ratman. Syndicated sex and sin. Murder for morons. Great little illustration there. So how it affects your family. How it affects your job. This depraved foreign filth is your boy's entertainment. It has a bunch of comic strips. Sensational stuff in this booklet here. How it affects your country. How the guns are loaded. Australian artists employed to paint this out on strips. So this is one way I dated it as 1949. It has a bunch of radio programs that were on. Some of them started earlier, some of them ended later, but there are some that did not start until 1949 that are listed here, and some that ended in 1949, did not continue to 1950. So this was published in 1949 based on those. And also based on this writing right here, I'll read this to you. New York psychiatrist Dr. Frederick Wortham, in his book, The Show of Violence, said, "The lack of respect for human life can begin in childhood in the comparative indifference to torture, mutilation, and death rife in comic books. These comic books are obscene glorifications of insolence and crime, of sadistic and masochistic social attitudes." So even in the 1940s, they were quoting Dr. Frederick Wortham. Of course, in the United States, he came out with the book, Seduction of the Innocent, and that was what really killed the comics in the United States. When that book came out, started a big furor over there. They were quoting him in his previous book, A Show of Violence, from 1949, which also dates this booklet as 1949. Did you know that there is little or no market for Australian publications in the USA? And there's another piece of this that says, Australia today has become the dumping ground for both the British and American artistic and literary product. English books entering this country in an unrestricted flow have either forced Australian publishers out of business or have compelled major cuts in the publication of Australian books. So they're slaying on the British and the American comics coming in. But what this is about is at the time, it was mostly about, it's from like the Communist Party wanting to keep the American comics out because they wanted to keep the country with their ideals and their beliefs. They did not want the Americanization of Australia. Even on the back cover here, what you can do to help. Protest to your local federal and state member. Protest direct to the Minister for Trade and Customs. Ensure your children read only Australian drawn comic books and strips. Protest to your local news agent. Ask your local mothers club, parents and citizens, federal branch, etc. to pass resolutions against the use of this material. We got some anti-comic propaganda. Sensational stuff. If you want to read everything that's inside these booklets, I have put this online. Same with all the British booklets. I know you can find them for sure in the EC Fan Addict Club on Facebook. So if you look online, you're bound to find the photos. I've taken pictures of every page of all these little booklets. You can just read the entire things. There's a lot of information in all of these. Here's the other one I have. This one isn't so much anti-comic propaganda. It's more sitting in the middle of the fence. Comics from Current Affairs Bulletin, the Commonwealth Office of Education, Grace Building, York Street, Sydney. 21st November 1949, Volume 5, Number 5. It's published fortnightly, price 4 pence. So this here, I'll open it up. As you can see, it starts on the inside of the front cover, page number 70. So it continues the page numbering from the previous issues. It talks about comics. Whether you think comic strips and comic books are just clean fun or view them with alarm as graphic stupidities that are doing untold harm to the community, there is no doubt that they have become a major social influence. And comics, what are they? Wide popularity. Kind of goes over the history of comics in here and how they're made. Comics are not all bad. See, so it's on both sides. What's bad about the comics? What's good about them? Comics in education and propaganda. To start you talking and for further reading, and then it ends page 83 until it continues into the next book there. It's another cool booklet. Only one I've ever seen. I've seen it referenced in books before, but I've never seen another one of these anywhere ever. Syndication I have seen, I think just like one other or maybe two others online. Also referenced in a bunch of books. So those are some really neat 1949 anti-comics booklets. I'll read you this. So I found this online, this information. This is really informative if you want to read this whole thing. It's A Design for Depravity, Horror Comics and the Challenge of Censorship in Australia, 1950 to 1986, paper written by Kevin Patrick. So it's got some great information here. I'll read you just some stuff that I pulled out of it, some really useful information. At their peak of popularity from 1950 to 1954, no fewer than 26 American publishers issued nearly 100 separate horror comic book titles, churning out nearly 2,500 issues between them. By 1952, horror comics accounted for nearly 1/3 of all comic magazines published in the United States. That's a lot. About 2,500 different full comic books were published in the States. Of the dozens of horror titles published in the United States, only 3 such publications were reprinted in Australia during the 1950s. The 3 series were Black Magic, and they had, I think, about 11 issues. It's what's on the Grand Comic Database. Journey into Unknown Worlds, which there's 4 issues that are listed, but they look like they're more sci-fi. I don't know if any horrors in them. And Adventures into the Unknown. So that is not listed on the Grand Comic Database, so I'm not sure exactly what that's referencing. I know that there was a British series of Adventures in the Unknown, but they didn't start until after 1955 in the UK in the British editions, and they were already code approved, sanitized, and not horror. So I don't know exactly what these ones are that they're referring to in Australia. But he goes on, nor were they commercially successful, lasting a handful of issues apiece, possibly indicating there was little demand for horror comics amongst Australian readers at that time. So, but really the only series, that I know of is the Black Magic series. So there's 11 of those. And even the later ones of those had like sci-fi mixed in with the horror. They had like Marvel sci-fi, like Atlas at the time was called, mixed in. Even on the covers, they had like sci-fi covers on some of them. But like I said, to note, in the British editions in the UK, they only had about 40 full horror comics. In Australia, they had 11. Really very, very few. That's not very many at all when considering there's 2,500 approximately in the United States. But they only had 11 that I know of, which would be this. True Amazing Accounts of Black Magic. You can find that on the Grand Comic Database. Here's the Australian Black Magic #1. So as far as I know, that's the only horror comics that they had. So this is after these booklets, because of course these booklets were 1949. The horror comics didn't really come out until 1950, when EC Comics came out with Tales from the Crypt, Crypt of Terror, Haunt of Fear, Vault of Horror, all the best horror comics ever. They came out around 1950 until 1955, of course. These ones, they didn't know what was coming. These are more against like the pulps of the time, and the crime comics were really big in the 40s. That's more the booklets we're referring to. But in the 1950s with the horror comics, there really wasn't much. There was only, like I said, 11 comics that would be in that one horror series, Black Magic. So anyway, it goes on inside this article. Calls for the prohibition of comic books grew ever louder throughout the 1950s. The Australian Council of School Organisations demanded at its 1951 annual conference that the federal government impose censorship on harmful comic books. A meeting of the Justices Association in 1952 declared that sexy and violent comics cultivated dangerous moronic tastes amongst young people. The National Council of Women of Victoria protested the inclusion of harmful and unwholesome comic books in the sample bags sold at the Royal Melbourne Show in 1953. Nor were such concerns the sole preserve of ostensibly conservative community groups and professional associations. The women's committees of the Waterside Workers' Federation of Australia organized conferences and other events throughout the 1950s to protest the sale of sex and war comics to children and declared their opposition to horror films and comics. Then it goes on from there. The Commonwealth government amended the customs prohibited imports regulations in December 1952 to include horror comics, thereby banning the importation of literature which, by words or pictures, in the opinion of the minister, A, unduly emphasizes matters of sex, horror, or crime, or B, is likely to encourage depravity. So they came out with actual legislation in 1952. It became a banned import. You couldn't bring in the comics themselves. But it turned out it was unnecessary that they even had that. They were already confiscating them. Apparently, as customs inspectors had already begun seizing imported American horror comics as early as February 1952, which was much before the regulation changed. It says one intercepted parcel addressed to a resident of Dover Heights, New South Wales, contained copies of Tales from the Crypt, Dark Mysteries, and Beyond, each of which were already listed in the accompanying minute paper as prohibited imports. The same parcel contained a copy of Venus, described by a customs investigation officer as a collection in comic strip form of strange stories of the supernatural. The comics which picture these supernatural creatures make them terrifying and repulsive, and since comics are read mainly by young readers, it is considered undesirable and its prohibition is recommended. But even though there's an import ban on the comics, so they were confiscating comics that were published in the United States that people were having shipped over, that wasn't even the biggest problem though, because they weren't reselling the American comics in Australia like that. They were doing is they were publishing their own using their print matrices. So they get the printing materials from the American companies after they had done their print runs. They would send matrices over and sell them in Australia and in the UK and around the world in foreign markets. And from the matrices, they would make printing plates, and then the publishers would print their own comics. And overseas, of course, in the foreign markets, they wouldn't always just reprint a single comic book like the exact same. A lot of times they didn't. A lot of times they had larger books, and they'd include 2-3 books or multiple stories from multiple different books, all combined under a custom-made new cover, or they redraw a cover or reuse a splash page from one of the stories inside and make a new cover out of the splash, and then they sell it that way. But they would have the matrices sent over. It wasn't so much the problem wasn't importing, it was the publishers republishing it using the matrices to make their own printing plates. And then it goes on to talk about that. With the Commonwealth powerless to ban locally published comic books, a conference of state government officers was convened in November 1952 to examine the possibility of the states taking uniform action to control children's literature, but no such agreement was reached. Instead, all Australian state governments, with the exception of Western Australia, amended existing laws or passed new legislation that widened the legal definition of obscenity to curb the availability of objectionable literature, such as comic books. So then they started coming out with laws, and they started making new legislation that banned the production of it, so you couldn't publish it there. But they really weren't already. They only really had the Black Magic comics, were the only horror comics. And then they also had, of course, they had the censored, they also like the westerns and the war comics. They had a lot of objectionable material also that they did not want in the children's comic books. So also in this paper it says, two Sydney firms, Cleveland Press and Calvert Publishing, both use content sourced from EC Comics, the New York publisher responsible for such notorious horror titles as Tales from the Crypt and The Haunt of Fear. Yet both Australian companies overlooked EC's horror titles, choosing stories from their science fiction and war comics instead. Okay, so I know that Cleveland Press, they published, I think it was called King Size Comic with EC stories inside. I don't have any of them, but there's also Calvert Publishing. So Calvert did most of the EC reprints. I have a bunch of their stuff. They published Piracy number 1 to 5. They did Two-Fisted Tales number 1 to 11. And there's Jungle Jim I have over there. Jungle Jim number 11 has one EC story in it from a piracy issue. And there's also Monster Western Adventure, which came out in the 60s, number 1 and 2. I have both of those, and there's 5 EC stories within those 2 books. And it's not listed here, but there's also Avon Publications had this series Ace Reporter, number 1 to 3, and I have those up there on the rack as well. And Ace Reporter reprinted Extra by EC Comics, about investigative reporters and that. And it's not mentioned in this paper that's online, but these non-horror EC comics, these Two-Fisted Tales and Piracy that they reprinted, were all heavily censored, which I'll show you in just a minute. So then it goes on. Other Australian companies opted for internal censorship, and that's what they did with the ECs also. They had internal censorship. Associated General Publications circulated its own code of ethics to all editorial staff in March 1954, which forbade illustrations which are offensively gruesome, together with any instances of sadism or freakish moral tendency. K.G. Murray Publishing modified the comics code used by the Comics Magazine Association of America as a basis for its own editorial guidelines. So that was the end of 1954, start of 1955. The comics code came out in the United States, and then K.G. Murray basically used the same comics code. That would be starting in 55. These tactics were born out of commercial self-preservation, were designed to appease the wider public and forestall any moves by hostile state governments to impose industry-wide censorship and regulation. So now we'll take a look at some of these EC stories that were reprinted in Australia. Some of them, they're edited to the point and censored that a lot of them, they don't make sense anymore. When you compare them to the original American versions, it's crazy how heavily they actually censored some of these comics and some items. But then later in the same story or the next panel, it was not censored, the same items, for some strange, completely unknown reason. I don't know, I don't get it. I'm very confused looking at some of these. But then, I mean, like, there's words that were changed, sentences were erased, people and objects removed, entire panels were blanked out. Like, it's crazy. We'll look over some of that now. So first I'll look at piracy. This is really cool. So, this is Australian Piracy number 1. It's actually the cover from this. This is the American original Piracy number 2. So they used the cover for number 2 to put on the Australian number 1. They changed the logo from blue to red. And right off the bat, they are no longer having a knife fight. There's 2 knives in the hands on the American original. They each have a knife. This one, the knives have been removed. They are just wrestling now, the pirates. And then what I'll show you is a story that's inside. It's actually the last story. It's called Shell Game. So this was published December 1954. This is pre-code. These were not sanitized stories in piracy. There was death, there was horror, there was everything. So they published that, and then so when they published this, the original was 6 pages. They published this version in the Australian comic. Instead of doing 6 pages, they left the first 4 pages the same, but then pages 5 and 6, they took off half the panels and they made it 1 page out of 2 separate pages by taking half of it away. So that's pretty crazy. They changed the entire ending of this comic by taking away 6 entire panels, which I'll show you. And as you see, they put the story on the back cover. A lot of Australian comics and a bunch of British comics also, they printed on the inside and outsides of the covers. So there's the last story right there. So when you look at the actual comic side by side, so the last page, only half of these are on from the last original page or in the Australian version, and there was another page before where they only used half of those. But they took out items like this entire panel here was removed because it says right here, slowly, relentlessly, the mighty monster clamps its gigantic vice-like shells closed, grinding bone, crushing and tearing flesh and muscle. You pull, tug, desperately trying to free yourself. No, oh God, no, not now, not when I finally found it. Nausea gags you, bile erupts from your mouth, the white-hot knives of pain spear through your body, starting to explode your tortured brain. Blackness begins to close in. Help me, somebody help me. You yank your lifeline once, twice, 3 times, then you slip into the blackness and the pain is no more. So, the clamping down the leg, totally removed. The next the next panel, totally removed. This one, they altered the words. Here's another completely removed panel. A violent tug wrenches you clear of the imprisoning giant sea clam, and bubbles of escaping air mix with the reddish-black stream of blood that spews forth. You're dragged upward across the jagged plank edges, scraping along the razor-sharp coral like a lifeless puppet on a string. They bring your limp body over the gunwale of the sloop and see the raw red stumps of your legs, and they know that it is too late, that you are dead. So they have the last panel in the Australian version, but you're no longer dead. It's just too late. And then they removed the text for that. And that panel before it, totally removed, along with a bunch of other panels. So they totally changed the story, just the last couple pages. The rest of the story, it's all just about a diver that's looking for treasure. So the rest of the story was fine. But the last 2 pages, they took out 6 of the panels over those 2 pages to make it into 1 page. So there's some censorship right there that happened. That would be very early on. Now look at another one. So over there is Jungle Jim 11, and inside it is one EC story, and the one EC story comes from Ragdoll, which is in Piracy number 5. So Piracy number 5 is code approved in the United States. It had this seal of approval from the Comics Code Authority. It was sanitized, but yet in this, this is a comparison. So the color is the American version, the black and white is the Australian version from Jungle Jim number 11. So some of the things they change in this is they take out the word kill and they say get, if you can't say the word kill. But they also like cutthroats, they becomes pirates. But they take out stuff like sobbing noises, there's crying that's removed. And then for some reason, they can't use anything to do with a stomach or belly or gut. It's strange. I don't understand it personally. But the word gutless in one frame becomes coward. And then on this page, here, the last page, in panel 3, the word stomach is removed and it becomes the word long. Because the rag doll, not even a person, but this rag doll, like teddy bear doll that this person has had since a child, it says that it had a gash in its stomach. But it's no longer a stomach gash, it's a long gash. And then the very last panel, it says that where he's sewn it, where the cutlass slashed across its stomach. And then it just changed to cutlass slashed across it. And the word stomach is just removed. So you can't even say the word stomach. It's so strangely censored in that story for some reason. And it's not even talking about a person's stomach being sewn up. It is a doll's stomach that was sewn back up on a rag doll. Here's what that actually was from. So that was out of Piracy number 5. This is the American original. And as you can see, approved by the Comics Code Authority. But apparently in Australia, they did not like the word stomach, and some other stuff, like the word kill was in there, and that was taken out. Next, we're looking at Monster. So Monster number 1. This is Monster, Western, and Adventure. It's got a really awesome Stanley Pitt cover on it. It's by Calvert Publishing, sometime in the early 60s. It reprints very heavily stories from Two-Fisted Tales number 40. It's got 2 stories, Flaming Coffins and Sharpshooter. So the first story, Flaming Coffins, it's got the most censorship I've ever seen in any story. It is 2 pages of items that were censored. So if you want to look at any of the stuff, also, I've already done full comparisons, and you can see everything that's been done differently in these books. Once again, EC Fan Addict Club on Facebook, I published all this stuff, and you can see exactly how much was changed. I'm just going to show you briefly some stuff, but it's crazy how much that they censored. And what they censored and what they did not censor. It doesn't make any sense. But here we have a fight. So you have color is American, of course, and black and white is the Australian. 2 guys are fighting. One with dark hair and one with blonde hair. In the American version, they're taking off their shirts, about ready to fight. The guy with the dark hair swings and misses. The blonde ducks underneath. In the Australian, he's not fighting anybody. He's just swinging at nothing. They removed the blonde guy he's fighting. He's not fighting anyone now. The guy's gone. He just disappeared. So he's swinging at nothing. But then the next panel, the blonde is punching him in the face, and they left that. So you can't show this guy swinging and missing, but you can show the other guy coming up and punching him in the face, and that's acceptable somehow. I don't understand how that kind of violence would be in this panel, but the miss is not shown, and the guy disappears. And you can see that there's some people that are going towards the fight in the background here also. That changes as well. So there's a miss, and this guy gets punched in the face. Then the blonde guy punches him. He falls his left, and he falls in with a right and knocks him over. But then here, he's gone. He's not on the ground. He disappears. So he punches at nothing, and there's nobody on the ground. And then also they strangely take out the people in the background. There's shadows of people watching. They're not there anymore like they were in the first panel of the fight. And then the final panel of the fight here, we got the guy with dark hair gets back up, and the blonde punches him again, and it has the word bop. So they show him punching him in the head again, and that's okay, but they took out the word bop. And then here they have him knocked out. That's it, just got punched out. He's unconscious on the ground. They removed him from the panel here, and they just made it look like grass. They blacked it out, so there's no knocked out person on the ground anymore. His body's gone, and the people in the background are also removed, the shadows who are standing there. So that's a strange fight, that it's okay to show some punches being landed, but they can't show misses. Different. The next page of that story, they take off other stuff. Here they take out a plane that's crashing. Plane was just removed from the panel entirely. That's crashing right here. And it's gone. But yet, strangely, so this is where it gets real funny, where they change stuff back and forth, where I'm not sure why to begin to change it at all, and why they wouldn't change all of it. It doesn't make any sense. None of this makes any sense to me. But the plane in the back is shooting at them, and you can see bullet trails, and there's fire starting. Plane is on fire. Here you can see the fire again, and the plane is still on fire in the Australian version. For some real strange reason, the pilot has his mouth open as he's looking back at the fire, and the other guy at the back, they edited his mouth to be closed. I don't know why they need to edit his mouth to be closed, but they did. They censored his open mouth, but the fire's there. Plane's on fire, plane's on fire. And it's flying while it's on fire, but now, in the American version, in the Australian version, it's not on fire anymore. They censored out the fire and the smoke trail. It's just flying perfectly fine. And then here, it's on fire, there's a smoke trail. Once again, in the Australian version, it's back on fire again, and there's a smoke trail. But here there wasn't. And then the next panel, there isn't again. There's a smoke trail. Then in the Australian version, they just make it look like clouds. They took out the smoke trail, so it's not on fire again. Fire's back out. The next panel, it's on fire. Australian version, the fire is not going. The fire is out, the smoke is gone. Then it crashes and explodes. In the Australian, it also crashes and explodes into a ball of flames. Only strangely, in the American version, the pilot jumps to safety. There he is, jumping out. At the last second, as the plane is ground, he jumps out and he is perfectly safe. The Australian version, he does not jump out and make it to safety. He apparently is killed in the explosion, which is much worse and much more violent. Doesn't make any sense why they wouldn't show him jumping to safety, but a lot of times they don't show people being safe and sound. I don't get it. Anyway, the plane is on fire, American version. The Australian version has the co-pilot trapped under the wings. The body of the plane has been removed, and the fire and the smoke. So he's just crushed under the wings of the plane, and he's stuck and can't get out. He's caught. In the next frame, same thing. He's telling Russell, she'll explode. But in the Australian version, it can't explode. It's not even on fire. Once again, fire is gone. The body of the plane is gone. The smoke is gone. It's not on fire. It can't explode. In the last page of the story, fire is still out. He's calling him a fool for trying to save him being crushed under the wings, even though there's no fire. Once again, it's still, the fire's out. It's perfectly fine, just some wings. It's not even a body of a plane. He calls him a fool, and then there's an explosion. Well, in the American version, he got the co-pilot and he's dragging him to safety. He pulls him away from the plane so he is not killed by the explosion. But in the Australian version, he has been censored out and removed. So the pilot no longer saves his co-pilot, who must be killed in the explosion, you would think, which is much more violent once again, instead of making it to safety. And then in the original American, there's fire in the background after the explosion, and there are two bodies laying there perfectly safe. They were not part of the explosion. They both lived. They're not dead. But in the Australian version, after the explosion, they're both gone. They both got vaporized by that explosion. Once again, much more violent. But then in the American version and the Australian is the same, where it talks to them and they're both perfectly safe. So they made it out of the explosion somehow. Although it just doesn't show how. I don't know why they wouldn't show them making it to safety, but that was censored out. So that's pretty crazy. And also in that same book, there was another story, Sharpshooter. Here just to show you some other ridiculousness. You can see bubbles here. It's missing a whole bunch of text. They blanked out a whole bunch of text. So this was also from Two-Fisted Tales number 40. This is story of Sharpshooter, and this is the last page. There are two snipers that are aiming at each other, is what happens in the final part of the story. One of them's up in a tree, one's on the ground. Kapow! And there's a puff of smoke after a shot was fired. And what happens is they both shot each other at the same time. It even says here in the next panel, shot each other at the same time. One fell out of a tree, the other's dead on the ground. They're both dead. But in the Australian version, it does not say that they must have shot each other at the same time, and it's a funny one. It says they spotted each other at the same time. They spotted each other. They didn't shoot each other. There's no puff of smoke. There's no shot being fired. It's just one of them must have just fallen out of the tree. Another one had a heart attack, and now they're both dead. The one that fell out of the tree, they were looking upon his face, on his body in the American original. In the Australian, he fell into a black hole. He is gone. They're not looking at him at all. There's nothing there to see. They black out all dead bodies that I've found just about. They let a few slip through, but anything close up, they always black out the dead bodies. Now we'll look at monster number 2. Another awesome Stanley Pitt cover. Here's Monster Western Adventure number 2 by Calvert Publishing, also in the early 60s also. This reprints stories Outpost from Two-Fisted Tales number 33 and Signal Corps, and then also the story Yellow from Two-Fisted Tales number 41. So just to show you quickly, couple little things from Outpost. So they took out a bunch of the text. They took out bloody. the word anywhere it said bloody, or it said murder, or it said bloomin'. They did not like the word bloomin' either, so they took bloomin' out. Couldn't say the word death. See, here's the last page. Here they took out a body. That's again, anything that's up close with a dead body will take out. So there's a dead body, totally removed and drawn over from the final frame. But here's one that's kind of strange that they didn't get is right here. You see a bunch of dead bodies. So they took out all those dead bodies and they blacked it out and made it look like just a bunch of rocks. But these guys, you see the bram sound. They have the gunfire noise. They have the clouds of smoke from the gunfire. This guy is running away. While running away, he's being shot in the back and killed and dropping his gun. And they allowed that guy to stay, who they are currently shooting. So I'm surprised they didn't edit that one out. That's kind of funny that they would have left that in there. Another story that was in that book is Yellow. They did stuff in that. They took out the word Lord. See, there's a big thing about blasphemy. You couldn't be sacrilegious in printing in that over in Australia. It's a big thing. But it was only sporadically taken out. So Lord was taken out, page 3, panel 2 of the story Yellow, and it was also removed from page 6, panel 4. However, the word Lord is kept in page 2, panel 3 twice. So it wasn't taken out for some strange reason. And then they also took out the word kill, death thrust, paste out kill 'em. They took out a lot of things. It's crazy how much stuff they took out. Lots and lots of stuff. And then look at one final story out of Monster number 2. So this is Signal Corps. So Signal Corps, this is out of, here's the American original, Two-Fisted Tales number 33. Came out in May 1953. So that's the cover story that we're talking about right now. Signal Corps. So they took out the word kill, kill 'em. Kill becomes harm. But then they do a lot of blacking out of bodies, but not all, once again. So here a grenade goes off. As far as we know, he is only injured, not killed. And they show his body later and other bodies. As far as we're concerned, this is just an injury. They took him out of the explosion. So an explosion happened, nobody got hurt. See, now after that, the American version, as you can see in color here, they go after the people, they're shooting, kill them, get them. So the kill them was taken out, they left get them. Then someone throws a grenade, and there's an explosion with a body flying through the explosion, and they left that person getting killed, and their body flying in the explosion here in the Australian version. That was okay. They never take that one out. But then down here, here's the lieutenant again that was hit by a grenade. So his body's laying there. As far as we know, he's still alive. It says, if the grenade didn't kill Lieutenant, then machine gun sure will. Not if we can help it. So they're trying to save his life still. As far as they know, he's alive. Blacked out of the Australian version. He's not on the ground out there anymore. This guy goes, he gets a truck to use the block. Truck gets shot a bunch of times. They showed that. But he makes it out okay. Then he goes and they have him run up a pole and cut a line. That's what's on the cover of the comic. He's going up a pole to cut this line, telephone line. He jumps down and he jumps to safety. In the American version, there are his feet going into the doorway as he makes it to safety, and he lives and he's okay. In the Australian version, they censored out his feet, so he is no longer making it to safety. I guess he must have been killed in the Australian version. Once again, completely needless for them to censor something like that when he lived. That's him making it to safety. Strangely, they censored that out. But the Australians are not the only ones that did the self-censoring. Also, though, they also did it in the UK. So here's just one example I'll give you quickly of the UK. So here's Prize Western. I used to have this book. This was out, British edition by Streamline Books. You can see some of the censoring that they did in this British book. Here they took off half a panel and a bunch of text, and then 2/3 of a panel, just blanked out. Like, they would not show fighting. They would not show anything in this British book. There's some more at the bottom. You can see text all blanked out. The bottom blanked out. Again, fighting at the bottom blanked out. So here's a couple pages. So this is the American original for a couple pages that are in it. You see there's fighting, there's killing here, so that's blanked out. But then down here, this entire bottom, these two squares and two text squares are completely removed. That are at the bottom of there. It's a fight. Nobody gets killed. Nobody really gets badly injured. In the next page, their fighting is done and they are talking to each other. But here he hits them in the head with an axe. As you can see closer up, here he's hitting them in the head with an axe. There they are fighting. They remove that entire thing and they put in this square where they rewrote all the text, but very messily. Like, it's not neatly written at all. They wrote the exact same text word for word and they removed the pictures. So now you just have one big rectangle text box because they could not show fighting. And then, also in the same comic, there's this gunfight. Doesn't even shoot a person. This guy in the American original shoots the gun out of his hand, and then he goes and he hits him in the head with the butt of his gun. In the British version, totally removed. So he shoots at nothing. He is not shooting the gun out of the guy's hand. He shoots at nothing because they blanked out him shooting a gun. You can't even shoot a gun. Not even shooting a person. And then here he hits the person with a gun. They cannot show him hitting the person with a gun. They show him just waving his fist in the air is all he is doing. So now he's standing there. Maybe this will teach you something, buddy. And that's it. They can't show him hitting someone over the head with a gun. So a lot of censorship, even in the UK. It wasn't just in Australia. There was a lot of censorship all over the place. Taking stuff out like that happened commonplace in the foreign markets and that. And here's even another example I'll leave you off with. I like this too. This is pretty cool. So this is some more censorship. This would be earlier in the 50s also, like 52 or 3 or something. Down with Crime. So this is the British edition, but this is the exact same cover as the American original edition. The gangster gets shot by the cops. You can see him shooting down here. Some gun smoke, and then he falls off the balcony, and his gun's there falling with him. He's been shot, and he's going to die, be killed. The Australian edition. The Australian edition, it's like a before and after. So they completely redrew it. They redrew a lot of covers back then, and they did a lot of custom covers of that. So this one, they didn't show him being shot and killed and falling off the balcony. They just showed the police shooting at him while he's up on the balcony still. So a neat little variant cover, kind of like a before and after photo. It's real neat, I thought. But anyway, so that's about it I got for the history of censorship in Australia and the comics campaign. It kept going on until the 70s. They relaxed restrictions. It was like 1971, and it was because of the horror films for the movies. They still had restrictions on the comics, but they relaxed them for the movies, and then shortly after they relaxed them for the comics too. I think it was 1972. A publisher in Australia, Gridown, they came out with tons and tons of reprints of American horror comics. So once it became acceptable there in the 70s, they started reprinting the American horror comics then in like 72 and on from then. But like in the 50s, they really didn't have very many horror comics over there. They just had Black Magic was really all that they had, I believe. But yep, that's what I got for it. There's a lot more information out there. He said you got to just do some research, look online. I'm just showing you a few things that I have here. Let everyone know some information that they probably didn't know and show you some stuff you've probably never seen before, and hope you enjoyed it. Cheers.